Hey now. How is everybody doing? Welcome to Red Alert Diaries with Tanya E. Hood. On this podcast, we have conversations that's real talk, marriage, divorce, money, and legacy. And I want you to join me on the journey. I share a lot of insight from the various hats that I've worn that have helped my clients make a strategic impact, both personally and professionally, to have better than what life has been giving them. On this podcast, I share a lot of that insight because I want to challenge your thoughts and inspire you to grow. So together, we can operate in excellence. Today, I want to talk about some principles from a story I'm certain that you've heard, David and Goliath. I don't know if you knew that David's story contained so much insight that will help you deal with the chaos that you often have that shows up in your life, insight that will give you the opportunity to build up your confidence, insight that will help you be reminded of the leader that's in you, even if nobody else knows. You see, when we open up the story and look at David's life, it begins with him not even being invited to a party. You see, during that time, the king, Saul, had displeased God, and Saul was now being replaced. And so Samuel, who was the prophet that went to go anoint and give insight about what's happening in the kingdom, knew that God told him to go anoint a new king. So he went to where God told him, Jesse's house. Now, Jesse had 8 sons. But when Jesse was told to invite his sons, he didn't even bother to invite David. David was the youngest out of all the kids. Now imagine how he felt knowing that Samuel was coming to his house. Now, it is often stated that around this time, David was a young man, maybe 14 years old or so, because he was out taking care of the sheep and the goat. And in that day and age, they didn't have young kids go through being involved or even invited into activities such as being told by dignitaries or whatever, because that's kind of the level that Samuel had. Well, David was not called. And as Samuel went through and Jesse presented his oldest son, Samuel just knew this had to be the one that God wanted. He had the look, he had the style, he had the feel. He was the one that you could just imagine could fit the elements of royal status. But he wasn't the one that God chose. You see, the thing that I love about this story is that God looks at us, the inside of who you are, your character, your being. Sometimes people choose what's on the outside or choose based off of the environment that you're in. But God looks at what's inside of you. And he knows because he put it there. And I'm so glad that God told Samuel, nope, that's not the one. And as Jesse presented son after son after son, it got to the point where Samuel was saying, do you have any more sons? Now, this is where I think in my mind, and this is just Tanya's backdrop, it gets a little bit interesting because David already knew his brothers were being called. And he may have thought that, well, I'm not old enough, or whatever the backdrop was in his life's dynamic. And we know, reading a little later on, that his older brothers picked with him. So he may have thought that he just wasn't worthy of being called either. So for him to see someone run into the pastures to call him to get ready to go, he just had to come. And I know that when he arrived, because Samuel told his brothers that they had to stand until David arrived, that David didn't have time to get dressed or change his clothes. So when he showed up like my grandmother often says, he showed up smelling like the great outdoors. When he came in, his brothers, who at that time would have been lined up according to age, had to wait for their younger brother to be presented. That had to do something to their heart. That had to do something inside of their soul. So there'll be some people that will enter into your life that will have to wait for you to come out of what's considered the dirty pastures, the backdrop, smelling like you don't belong. Well, that was the environment that David found himself in. And it was then, in front of his family, that he was anointed the next king. And right after it was over, David had to go back outside to the pasture. You see, there will be something in your life that you know you are the leader of, but your time to lead would not have yet come. David found himself in a place that even though he was anointed king, he had to go back out and take care of his daddy's sheep and his goat. You may be in a situation on your job or in some professional environment or maybe personal environment where you know you are the next leader. But in this moment, at this time, you are in a position where you serve. I want you to know, serve well, serve good, because one of the things that happened while David was out in the pastures, he was honing his skills. He was giving himself a name that I don't think he ever really recognized. Because after that moment, and I'm guessing the way the story is written, a couple of years later, how David was operating in the backdrop, in the background, in the pasture with the sheep and the goats. He was doing really good because Saul was now being tormented. You see, there's something that the leaders in your environment are dealing with, a problem that is tormenting them. What is that problem? That problem still needs to be solved. And you are probably being prepared right now in the silence, knowing that that is a position that you may one day take over. Do what you need now to make certain that your skills are at their best. If there's some new skills that you need to learn, start preparing them now and be okay with doing it in the dark because somebody somewhere may hear of your excellence. Now, the thought back then, because one of the most popular things with music at that time was the harp. And it was stated to Saul that Jesse had a son that was a master at doing and playing the harp. See, David was a master musician on top of everything else. He may have been out there in the background while he was doing one thing that he was told to do. It may not have been maximizing his skills because the way that I visualize it, the way God gives me a download of the Bible, I imagine what's happening now. Where are you working that you have to do some rudimentary things? It doesn't even require all of your skill. It doesn't even require all of your talent, but you're there to do it because you know it's your job. In the background, while you do what you need to do, you do some things that you want to do. I'm certain music is one of David's first loves because it's also David that wrote a lot of the Psalms. And when you're in church, songs that a lot of people hear. So while he was doing what he was supposed to do, he was enhancing a skill that he loved and enjoyed. You can turn a hobby that you enjoy, a skill that you're working on in the background while you're doing a thing that you need to do, into something that will be of use in a greater environment. Because David was called to the palace to soothe Saul's soul with the harp. David was called from the background into the environment that he was one day going to lead. Just do what you need to do because one day somebody may call you from the background to be in position in the place that you will one day lead. By being called, because he was considered a couple of things. He was considered the master of musician because of that. He was also called a man of war. Somewhere in between, David had gotten some accolades about being able to do some things strategically with war. Because when he came to the palace to soothe Saul, he was also given the task of being Saul's armor bearer. Now, when I was reading about this, I was trying to figure out the armor bearer. Who is that person? And if you've ever watched some of those medieval movies, and I like to watch some of those movies, it's just something about that time period that just resonates in my soul. And you see that there's a knight, and with the knight is often somebody following him, an assistant. That young boy that's carrying all of his armor, sharpening his tools, getting things prepared, shining them up, and also putting the armor on him when it comes time to battle. That guy, that young little guy that was doing all those things, that was David's position. See, even when he arrived into the place that he would one day lead, he still had a position that was on the bottom, that was assisting. If you're in a position where you're an assistant, do it and do it well. He was so great at just being an assistant and doing the job that was asked of him of soothing Saul's soul and hearing what others said about David, Saul elevated him in an assistant manner in a couple of different ways. So while David was there, he got the chance to see how the kingdom is run. While David was there, he got the chance to see and get some insight about who the dignitaries or individuals that he may need to have conversations with when he became king. You see, Saul didn't know that David was anointed king, but David knew. You don't have to announce your role because when David was announced to Saul, he was announced as the shepherd. There's a title that you may have right now that does not fit what you know is your skill, that does not fit what you know to be true about your being. Don't get hung up on the titles. If somebody has to have a title in order for them to figure out how to deal with you, let them have the titles, but don't let your limitations be stuck there. Yes, David was a shepherd. That was true. But inside David was the king that was anointed already. David was aware of his leadership abilities. David was aware of the skills that he brought to the table. And David also shared that later on. Because as we go through the story, we find out that the Philistines were going to war with Israel. And that's where Goliath comes in. You see, Goliath was the Philistine leader. He was their champion. He was the one that they sent out onto the battlefield. And it is also stated that he had been trained as a warrior since his youth. Everything about Goliath was training for the moments of war. Most of the things about David was training to be a shepherd, care for things, be mindful. So David had a different proclivity and a different sensitivity when it came to how he was managing things around him, and it served him well as king. I want you to know that if you are put in a position where it seems like everybody around you was raised from childhood to perform that role, if you are called by God, he will elevate you with the skills that's already in you to perform that thing that you're supposed to do. So when the armies came and they sent Goliath out, all these grown men, and you know that David wasn't even 18 years old, because at that time, to join the army, and it's still the same in Israel today, you got to be 18 years old to join the army. So we know he wasn't yet 18. And we also recognize, because his father had him run back and forth between the palace and home to do his job. Just because he was put in a position on his 9 to 5, he still had to do his 5 to 9. A lot of you have heard me share that discussion in a couple of different podcasts. But David had to still do what he was supposed to do, manage his father's sheep, do what he was asked to do of Saul. And in the middle of all of that, know who he was at the core of his being. The thing that I love about the story of David and Goliath, we often hear when the battle takes place, but the pieces that really makes the story a profound story, a supportive story, is what happens before he even meets Goliath. He was doing double duty. You may be doing double duty as well, working your full-time job and still having to go back home and do some things there, going off and doing the things that you know you need to care for what you are responsible for. Because when David's father sent him to go take lunch to his brothers, he passed the lunch off to the supplier, the keeper of the supplies, like he was asked. But he also went to go greet his brothers, and they still treated him like the little brother that was being bothersome. And while they were treating him like the little brother, he heard Goliath taunting the army of Israel. Now, he had done this every day for 40 days. They would get up in the morning and march towards the battlefield, everybody. So this was a moment where David rose early so that he can deliver the food to his brothers before they sort of clocked in to their job. And while they were getting ready to clock in and David heard Goliath spewing all this stuff about God's army, David asked, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" David had some gumption with him. Now, he may not have been old enough to join the army, but he had the heart that God was looking for to defeat anybody coming up in that army. You may not look like you belong where you are supposed to be, where others think that you're too young or you just don't fit. It's okay. You still have the heart to be in that place. You still have the heart to be in that position. I want to encourage you today to let your heart lead you, let your heart guide you, because if God has put it in you, He's already equipped you to get the job done. Now, when David was hearing what was happening, there was also some individuals saying that there's a reward that the king is offering for the person that goes and kills Goliath. Because back then, to cut down on some of the bloodshed, each army would send out their best warrior. Goliath was the Philistines' best warrior. Saul, ideally, should have been Israel's best warrior. He was the king. He was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. So, this 9-foot giant with armor that weighed 125 pounds, with a spear that was the size of a pillar, with the spearhead made of bronze that was 15 pounds by itself. And Goliath had his own armor bearer. He had somebody that walked before him on the field just to carry his shield. With something in your life that big, that massive, and you being the king, taller than everybody in your whole country, you should have been the one that met Goliath on the battlefield instead of letting him taunt your army for 40 days. But when David went to Saul and said, I can defeat him, I will fight him for you. Now, some say that David did it because Saul had offered whoever kills Goliath the opportunity to have all of their family's taxes exempt. Now, in this day and age, with all the stuff that's happening with taxes, it'd be great for everybody in your family to have tax exempt status because of something that you did. But you still got to go fight the giant. You still got to go up against that thing that causes fear. What is it in your life that causes fear in others that you just decide, because I have confidence in the battles that I know God has already brought me through, I can face this battle as well? David was prepared before he ever met Goliath to fight the battles. You are also prepared before you even meet your Goliath to fight your battles. And so for today, if you don't remember anything else I've shared, here's the one thing I want you to know. Before you meet your Goliath, there are things that you have been prepared for. Even if you don't look like where you are going is where you are right now, and it's okay. Hone your skills so that you are considered a master and others tell the stories about how great you are with the thing that you do, even though you know that's where you're supposed to be and the title is not yet given to you. Operate in excellence. Hone and be the best master at whatever it is you're doing. For David, it was being a shepherd, a master musician, which prepared him when he faced his Goliath to have confidence in God, because there were small battles like killing lions and bears. Those are plural. So we know David had to do it a couple times. You've already faced your lions. You've already faced your bears. And when it's time for you to be centered in limelight, you will be able to face your Goliath as well. And if you want someone to join you on the journey, feel free to go to my website, tanyaehood.com. There you can find the various ways that we can connect with one another. And if you're on Instagram, you can join me live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we can continue the conversation or we can start a new one. In the meantime, this is Tanya E. Hood, walking in my purpose, and I want you to do the same.